key came sliding under my door at 2:11 in the morning while I was still holding my shoes, and the note folded around it said, in handwriting I'd know anywhere, and a sentence I couldn't explain at all. In case you ever need in. 4C. I stood in my dark apartment, 30 seconds off a 12-hour ER shift, listening to footsteps cross the hall and a door close softly, and I did the math a woman does at 2 a.m. That was Felix. Quiet Felix. Across the hall, Felix, who I have technically never had a conversation with longer than 1 minute, but who I have been talking to for an entire year, because the Verlaine has thin walls and thick doors, and somewhere last spring we started leaving each other sticky notes. Mine on his door. Your kettle whistled for 10 minutes. Are you alive? His on mine? Alive. Distracted. Your umbrella is drying on my rail. It was about to fly to New Jersey. A year of that. A year of a man I'd recognize by handwriting before face. And now his handwriting was telling me I might need in. Not come by. Not in case you lock yourself out. In case you ever need in, which is the kind of sentence that's either the sweetest thing a neighbor has ever done or the opening line of a documentary with a hotline number at the end, and I genuinely could not tell which, and I was still deciding whether to knock on 4C at 2 a.m. and ask, when the drilling started, below me. In the bones of the building. At 2:14 in the morning, a low, patient, structural sound, the kind you feel in the floor through your bare feet, coming up from the basement of a building where, I want this noted, nothing had been repaired since the new owners bought it 8 months ago. I know, because I'd been asking. Every tenant in the Verlaine had been asking. Kessler Property Group had bought our beautiful, rent-stabilized, 98-year-old building in the spring, and since then, we'd gotten no repairs, 4 buyout offers apiece, 2 mysterious water shutoffs, and now, apparently, a work crew that only existed between 2 and 4 in the morning. I fell asleep with the key on my nightstand and the drill in the floor, and woke up to find out that the note under my door had been the nice thing slid at me that night. Taped to my door in the morning light was a notice on Kessler letterhead, notice of lease violation, unauthorized occupant/illegal sublet, cure or quit. Me. Cora Ellery RN, who lives so alone that my emergency contact is my charge nurse, cited for harboring an unauthorized occupant. At the bottom, a number to call to resolve this matter, and a signature stamp for a man I'd meet soon enough. R. Kessler. I worked that night's shift with the violation notice folded in my scrubs pocket, like a lab result I didn't want to read twice. I triage for a living. You learn to read the difference between a symptom and a story, and the Verlaine's chart was telling a story. No repairs, then buyouts, then shutoffs, then phantom violations, then night drilling. Escalating interventions. That's not neglect. Neglect is lazy. This had a schedule, and at 6:40 the next morning, the schedule reached my apartment. I came home to water, not a puddle, a sheet of it, gliding out from under my own door into the hall, and inside, my ceiling's corner sagging like wet paper, my bathroom wall weeping through the paint, a pipe that had held for 98 years choosing, the plumber Kessler sent would later shrug, just one of those things, old buildings. By noon there were fans and a work order. By 3, while I slept at a friend's, the crew had to secure the unit for remediation, and when I came back at 6 to get my uniforms, my key spun uselessly in a brand new lock, and the super, a new man, Kessler's man, arms crossed in front of my own door, informed me the unit was unsafe for occupancy during repairs, that I'd be notified when access is restored, and that no, he couldn't say when, and no, he couldn't let me get my things. Ma'am, liability, you understand. Locked out of my apartment, in scrubs, holding a dead key, with a manufactured violation in my pocket, and my whole life on the other side of a door I paid for. I stood in that hallway and felt the thing they wanted me to feel, small and tired, and like signing whatever made it stop. And I want you to remember that feeling, because this entire story is about the difference between the people who engineer that feeling and the one man in the building who'd been engineering something else. Because I did have one key that worked. In case you ever need in, 4C's lock turned like it had been oiled for the occasion. I pushed the door open, already apologizing out loud to an apartment I assumed would look like mine, and stopped with my hand still on the knob, because Felix Moreau's apartment does not look like mine. The layout was mine, mirrored. Everything else was mission control. The living room wall, the whole wall, was the Verlaine, drawn huge and precise. Floor plans, riser diagrams, a cutaway of the building's skeleton annotated in draftsman's lettering. Dated photographs marched across it in grids. The basement, the boiler room, the crawl spaces, the same beams shot week after week after week, like growth charts. A folding table held instruments I only half recognized: a moisture meter, a laser level, something with a coiled camera cable, and a logbook, thick, laid open to a page with that morning's date, and an entry at 2:14 a.m., drilling resumes, north-bearing line, 41 minutes. Recorded. He'd been awake too. He'd been taking notes. And in the middle of the table, propped against a coffee mug, one more sticky note, in the handwriting I'd know before his face, dated, addressed, waiting, like he'd read the whole week in advance. Cora. If you're using the key, they've started on your line. I'm sorry about your ceiling. It was always going to be your ceiling. I can show you why. Coffee's in the cabinet, towels in the hall closet, and whatever you do, don't call the number on the notice. Back by 8. F. I stood alone in my quiet neighbor's war room, dripping slightly, holding a year of sticky notes worth of trust in one hand and a dead key to my own life in the other. And I looked at that wall of my building's bones, and I said, out loud, to no one, Felix, what are you? He came back at 7:52 with dust on his boots and a borescope over his shoulder, and found me sitting at his table with his logbook and both hands around a coffee I hadn't drunk. And to his eternal credit, Felix Moreau did not perform surprise. He looked at me, and at the key on the table, and something in his shoulders came down half an inch, like a man setting down a bag he'd carried a long way. You got flooded, he said, and then locked out. You knew that would happen. I knew it would happen to whoever was over the north-bearing line. I hoped it wouldn't be you. He set the borescope down. I'm going to tell you everything, and it's going to take 20 minutes, and at the end, you're going to want to call people, and I need you to hear all of it before you touch a phone. Deal? Here is Felix's 20 minutes, and I'm giving it to you the way he gave it to me, because how a person explains a thing tells you who they are. No drama, dates in order, sources named, like a man reading a chart. I'm a structural engineer, 11 years, licensed, most of it at a firm called Ashwell plus Grieg. 14 months ago, Kessler Property Group hired us for a pre-acquisition assessment of this building. He touched the wall, the cutaway skeleton. I did it myself, 3 days in her bones. And the Verlaine is sound, Cora. She's 98 and she'll do 98 more. They built her like a bank vault. I wrote that, filed it. A beat. 2 weeks later, my managing partner asked me to revise the report. Kessler wanted flexibility, wanted language about progressive structural deterioration that would support, his phrase, I have the email, future vacancy strategies. Felix's voice stayed level in a way that must cost something. A rent-stabilized building full of protected tenants is worth a fraction of an empty one. You can't evict 91 people, but if the city orders the building vacated as unsafe, no evictions, no buyouts, no villain. Everyone out in 72 hours, no right of return, and every lease in this building dies of natural causes. All Kessler needed was a structural report willing to lie. You refused. I refused. 6 weeks later, I was laid off. Restructuring. Kessler got his report anyway. There's always another stamp for hire. His is a semi-retired engineer named Dorian Voss. He caught himself. Named Petrosian, who hasn't climbed into a crawl space since I was in high school. I appealed to my old firm's ethics board. Pending. I filed a complaint with the licensing board. Pending. Everything is always pending. He looked at the wall of photographs. And then Mrs. Odette died. I knew the name the way you know building saints. Odette Moreau, 4C, 51 years in the Verlaine, the woman who ran the lobby like a consulate. She died last winter, before my flood, before Kessler's letterhead. Moreau, your mother, I said. My mother. He said it the way you set down something warm. I grew up in this apartment. She was the tenant association, back when it needed to be one woman with a clipboard. When she died, the lease had my name on it too, succession rights. She added me years ago, said a building this old should always have one Moreau on paper. Kessler's people offered me $40,000 to walk away from it before the funeral flowers wilted. Half a smile with nothing in it. So instead I moved in. Because I'd read the honest report and I'd read the dishonest one, and I knew what Kessler bought this building planning to do. And 4C sits on the north-bearing line, one floor over the basement runs where all of it would have to happen. I didn't move home to grieve, Cora. I moved home to witness. 51 years my mother watched this building's people. He nodded at the instrument table. I watch its bones. It's the same job. I want to tell you what I was feeling, but this is the part of my story where feelings had to wait, because Felix flipped the logbook to the front and showed me the schedule I'd sensed from my scrub's pocket. Except it wasn't a metaphor anymore. It was pages. Buyout offers, dated. Shutoffs, dated. The night cruise, 11 visits in 9 weeks. Everyone logged, timed, recorded through the riser shaft with a contact mic. Drilling and cutting. Always the same 3 joist bays. Always the north line. Moisture readings from the basement climbing week over week. There's a hose, Cora. An actual garden hose, feeding the north footing since March. I have it on video. And the crown jewel, pulled from the city's own portal, Kessler's expediter had already filed. Emergency structural inspection, Department of Buildings, the 21st, 9 a.m., requested by the owner. Supporting documentation, the Petrosian report. That's 12 days from now, Felix said. Here's the play. The inspector walks in on the 21st with a report in his hand that says, this building is failing. He goes to the basement, and he finds exactly what the report promised. Cracked plaster they hosed into existence, notched joists they cut themselves at 2 a.m., sagging they manufactured, because the easiest lie in the world is the one you've prepared the evidence for. He has no choice. Emergency vacate order, 72 hours, 91 tenants out on the sidewalk with a city seal on it, and Kessler standing there in a hard hat, looking like the man who saved us from our own building. He closed the logbook. They're not repairing the Verlaine, Cora. They're rehearsing her funeral. And the flowers arrive on the 21st at 9 a.m. 12 days. I looked at the wall, his mother's building, his great wall of vigil, and then at the violation notice still folded in my pocket, and I finally asked the small question inside the big one. Why me? The key. Why did you slide it under my door? And Felix Moreau, who documents everything, looked briefly like a man with no data. Because your line was next on their schedule, he said, which was true. And then, after exactly 1 second too long, and because you're the only person in this building who checks whether I'm alive when my kettle whistles too long, I figured I owed you a door. You'd think the next move was obvious. Take the wall, the logbook, the video of the hose, and march it all downtown. I said exactly that. Around 8:30, on his fire escape with the second coffee, Felix shook his head slowly and gave me the education that the next 12 days would keep proving right. Think like triage, he said, which was unfair and effective. A fired engineer, currently in a licensing dispute with the firm that stamped the owner's report, living rent-stabilized in the very building he's defending, walks into the DOB with accusations against a licensed colleague and a property group that pulls permits in this city every week. What do I look like? A disgruntled tenant with a conflict of interest and a grudge. With beautiful documentation, he agreed, which they will politely accept and file, and route to the same desk where my 2 complaints have been pending since spring. Kessler doesn't win because people believe him, Cora. He wins because he's procedural. Every crime is a permit, every lie has a stamp. So we don't beat him with a story. We beat him on the 21st, in person, with physics, physical evidence, chain of custody, independent witnesses, and one honest inspector having a very surprising morning. Buildings don't lie. He tipped his mug at the city. People with clipboards do. Our whole job is to get the building on the witness stand. The next 12 days were the strangest and, I'll say it, the best of my year, which tells you something about my year. By day, I pulled ER shifts and slept at my friend Dara's. By night, I became the second name in the logbook. Felix taught me to read a moisture meter and log a chain of custody. I taught him that you can canvass a building exactly the way you round on patients. Door by door, chart in hand, no drama. When did the symptoms start? And the Verlaine, once you asked her 91 tenants the right questions, had been keeping her own records all along. Mr. Okonkwo in 3A had photos of the basement from a June boiler complaint. Joists clean, no cracks, time-stamped. The real sisters in 2F had saved every buyout letter, a rising column of numbers with rising menace to match. And Marisol in 1B, whose stroller made her the only tenant who used the service corridor daily, had twice seen the night crew carrying in, she'd assumed she was crazy, bags of dust. Who brings dust into a building, she asked us. Men manufacturing the appearance of a crumbling one. Is who? Plaster dust? For sprinkling around fresh saw cuts, so new wounds read as old age. Felix logged it with his jaw tight. Then we found the third-floor kid, Dev, 16, who'd been flying a camera drone off the roof all summer over his mother's objections, and who possessed, filed under cool trucks, footage of the unmarked crew unloading at 1:50 a.m. on 4 separate dates. Dev is in the logbook now under aerial reconnaissance. Dev has peaked in life and knows it. On day 5, we drove out to see the tenant who wasn't behind a door anymore. Her name is Ruth Feld, 2B for 38 years, and she'd left the Verlaine in an ambulance in April, during the second water shutoff. On a night the stairwell lights were also mysteriously out. 79 years old, feeling her way down 4 flights with a water jug because the taps were dry. She fell on the second-floor landing, broken hip, and while she was in surgery and then in rehab, Kessler's office had sent her, I have seen the letter, I held it in my hands in that rehab day room, a notice that her apartment was deemed abandoned, her lease surrendered by conduct, her belongings inventoried and stored. They took a 38-year home off a woman in a hospital bed with a form letter, and 2B, we now knew from the permits, sat conveniently empty, directly over the north basement runs, the first domino they'd cleared. I keep telling the girls here I didn't abandon anything, Mrs. Feld told us, sitting very upright in a cardigan with a tissue in the sleeve, and then she looked at Felix and her whole face changed. You're Odette's boy, the engineer. And when he nodded, she reached into the drawer of her nightstand and took out a phone in a padded case with a cross-stitched cover, and said the sentence that put her in the logbook in capital letters, then you'll want April. I photographed those men in the basement when I went down about the boiler. Odette always said, tissue to the eyes, quick, businesslike. Odette always said, if you see something in this building, you make a record. She'd have liked that I remembered. 6 photos. Time-stamped April, the North Bays. Clean joists, no cracks, and 2 men in unmarked coveralls looking extremely surprised to be photographed. The state of the building before the murder, witnessed by its longest resident, taken on the advice of a dead woman who was still, somehow, running the tenant association. Felix held that phone like communion. Our attorney, when she saw the photos, said a word I won't repeat, and then, immediately, affidavit, today, before anyone visits her but us. We left with the photos and a promise, which we have since kept, that Ruth Feld would sign her next lease at the Verlaine, and not in a day room. On day 4, I'm keeping the order honest. The day's blurred but the logbook doesn't. Kessler came in person, because the notices weren't landing, and men like him always eventually want to see your face when you fold. He caught me in the lobby in my scrubs. He times things. I'd learn he always times things. Silver-haired, cashmere over the shoulders, smile like a showroom. Miss Ellery, the nurse from 4D. He said it warmly, the way you'd say the problem in 4D. I heard about your flood. Terrible. Old buildings, you know. They age. A step closer, voice dropping into confidentiality. Between us, the engineering reports are worrying. I'd hate for you to hold out for a lease in a building that may not keep its tenants much longer, through no one's fault. My last buyout offer expires with the month. Take the money, find somewhere with working pipes. Buildings age, sweetheart. The smile widened exactly 1 notch. So do leases. I looked at this man, who had hosed a foundation, cut his own joists, locked me out of my life, and was now selling me my own manufactured misfortune as weather, and I gave him the ER smile, the one for people who demand antibiotics for a virus, and said, funny thing about my job, Mr. Kessler, I chart everything, habit. And I wrote the date and time on the back of his buyout card, in front of him, slowly, and put it in my scrubs pocket, and watched something flicker behind the showroom. That flicker cost us. 2 nights later, someone tried 4C's lock at 3 a.m. We have the door cam clip, a gloved hand, 40 seconds of patience, gone. The morning after, the new super was photographed, by Dev, obviously, photographing Felix's mail, and on day 8, Felix's storage cage in the basement was flooded by accident. Soaked cardboard, warped boxes, a message wearing a coincidence. They were mapping us now. Felix's answer was pure Felix. He spent 1 full night making 3 complete copies of everything. Logbook scans, drives, affidavits, and by 6 a.m., 1 set lived in Dara's gun safe, 1 in the real sister's piano bench, and 1 in a lawyer's office downtown, because by day 8 we had a lawyer. The tenant association, extinct since Odette Moreau's clipboard, had voted itself back into existence in the Richiel's living room, 11 apartments strong, and retained the kind of housing attorney who asks, is the hose still running, with visible joy. Day 9, before midnight and the blueprints, there was the basement. And I need to tell you about the basement, because it's the closest this story came to going wrong. The evidence set had one hole in it. Every photo of the fresh saw cuts was Felix's, and Felix was attackable. We needed the cuts documented by a second witness with her own phone, her own hands, her own affidavit. The crew's pattern said no visit that night. Mr. Okonkwo's constitutional confirmed the alley dark, so at 1:30 a.m., two law-abiding citizens with every legal right to their own basement went down the service stairs with a borescope, gloves, and my charting habit. And I will tell you that no code I have ever worked made my heart do what that basement did. Felix moved through the dark like a man in his own bloodstream. Fourth step sings, "Skip it," and put the borescope into the second joist bay, and on the little screen I watched the lie up close for the first time. Bright, clean saw faces, wood the color of fresh bread where century-old timber should be dark as tea, and dust, Marisol's dust, sprinkled on top, sitting on the cuts like snow that had fallen upward. I photographed everything, narrated dates and bays into my phone in my charting voice, steady, steady, and then the service door, one flight up, opened. Light under the stairwell door. Footsteps. Keys. The lazy jingle of a man who owns his rounds. The new super, off schedule, either insomniac or scent. Felix killed the borescope screen with his thumb, took my sleeve, and walked, unhurried, silent, because hurry is loud, behind the old coal chute partition his great-grandfather had bricked, and his childhood had mapped, and we stood in the dark 2 inches apart, exactly the way this story started, my heart going like a monitor with the alarms muted, while a flashlight beam swept the bays where my phone with everything on it, sat face down on a joist ledge 6 feet from the super's shoulder. He didn't look up. They never look up. Felix logs that too. The beam checked the hose. The hose. He checked the hose. Tending the wound. And the footsteps and the jingle climbed away. And the door shut. And in the dark behind his great-grandfather's brick, Felix Moreau let out a breath and whispered the only unprofessional sentence of the entire operation. "Your charting voice is very calming." Noted for the record. I retrieved my phone. We climbed out. The affidavit says none of the fun parts. Day 10, Kessler stopped mapping and fired. 2 process servers hit the Verlaine within an hour of each other, which tells you it was choreographed, which tells you we'd been promoted. The first found me coming off shift. My unauthorized occupant violation had ripened, uncured. Cured how? There was no occupant, into a full termination notice and an eviction petition, with a court date that would put an open case on my record whether I won or not. Ask any nurse who rents. An eviction filing follows you like a bad reference for a decade. Landlords screen for the filing, not the outcome. He wasn't trying to beat me in court. He was trying to make me radioactive to every other building in the city, so that fighting for the Verlaine meant risking any home at all. The second server was for Felix, and it was nastier, because it was aimed at the grief, a petition challenging his succession rights to 4C, alleging his mother's addition of his name was procured irregularly, demanding documentation of primary residence, co-occupancy, the authenticity of the decedent's signature. They were making him prove, with exhibits, in front of a judge, that his dying mother had really wanted him home. I watched him read it at the war room table, twice, the metronome hands perfectly steady, and then he said, in the most dangerous voice I'd heard him use, "She signed it at that table, I made her tea." And then he did the most Felix thing imaginable. He pulled the lease file, and his mother's signature had been notarized. Of course it had. Odette Moreau made records, and he logged both petitions into the evidence set under a new tab our attorney had just created, titled, "With Visible Joy, Retaliation, Documented, Running." Everything he files against us before the 21st, she told the association that night, is another exhibit that he knew the tenants were witnesses. Let him keep typing. 11 days of pressure, and here is what I want you to know about the Verlaine in that stretch. Nobody broke. The real sisters started a stairwell phone tree. Mr. Okonkwo walked the basement perimeter every night at midnight. For my constitutional. Dara, not even a tenant, drove my uniforms across town, so I never once showed up to shift, wrinkled by Roman Kessler. You can manufacture a crack in a building. 91 people are harder engineering. One more thing, Felix said. Day 9. The logbook says day 9. The eviction papers came after, but I'm telling you this part here because it's the part that mattered. Midnight, at the war room table. The report Petrosian stamped, it hangs everything on one claim: a deteriorated primary girder in the north basement wall, inaccessible for direct inspection, condition inferred. It's the anchor. The inspector can't verify it, so he has to trust the stamp, and the stamp says the building's spine is failing. He pulled out a cardboard tube and his hands, I'd watched those hands log evidence for 9 days steady as a metronome, were, for the first time, not entirely steady. Except there's a problem with their girder, Cora, and she's been in this apartment for 50 years. He uncapped the tube and rolled paper across the table. Old paper, linen-backed, the blue gone soft as dusk. Original drawings, the Verlaine Apartments, 1928, and in the title block, in drafting letters nearly a century old, A. Moreau & Sons, Masonry and Ironwork. My great-grandfather, Felix said quietly. He didn't design her, but he built her. Every course of brick, every steel member, his crew. The architect's office burned in '61. The city's file copies are 2 sheets and a prayer. But masons keep their own sets. And Moreaus don't throw out paper. My mother kept these behind the hall closet, same place her father kept them. He walked his fingers across the basement plan to the north wall, and tapped a run of steel, and looked up at me with the whole case in his eyes. Cora, the deteriorated primary girder, in Petrosian's report, the failing spine, the anchor claim, the thing too inaccessible to verify? Tap tap. It isn't there. The north line was built clear span on paired columns. There is no girder in that wall. There never was. Petrosian inferred the decay of a beam that does not exist, because he copied language from a generic template instead of climbing down like an engineer. They built their whole condemnation on a bone this building doesn't have. He let out a breath 14 months long. My great-grandfather put steel exactly where it belongs, which means I know exactly where it isn't. And on the 21st, so will the city. I looked at the blueprints and then at him, and I said, with medical precision, "You're telling me the murder weapon is imaginary." "I'm telling you," said Felix, "that they forged a death certificate for a healthy patient, and I have her birth records." We worked until 3. And when I finally stood to go, Dara's couch was calling. I stopped at his hallway closet for the towels, and that's when I saw the drawer. Open just an inch, because he'd pulled the blueprint tube from behind it. A shallow drawer, and inside, filed in neat chronological rows like everything else in that apartment. Sticky notes. Yellow, pink, blue, curling at the edges. Mine. All of them. A year of them. Kettle whistled. Are you alive? Umbrella. The dumb ones. The grocery list one that got stuck to his door by accident. Every note I had ever slapped on 4C at 2 a.m., each one flattened and kept like a specimen of something worth keeping. I stood there holding towels. Felix went very still at the table, a man watching his one undocumented secret walk into evidence. You kept them, I said. A year of my garbage notes. A year of your handwriting, said Felix Moreau, structural engineer to the blueprints, unable to look at me, and the Verlaine's thin old walls held their breath, and I put down the towels, and reader, we were both extremely professional and focused on the case, and that is my testimony, and I am sticking to it until the epilogue. The 21st, 8:40 a.m., Kessler arrived early with his expediter, his attorney, the new super, and a hard hat he carried like a prop, staging the lobby, positioning himself as the concerned owner ready to guide the inspection along the path his crew had spent 9 weeks paving. At 8:55, the DOB inspector came up the steps. A broad, unhurried woman named Inspector Reyes, with 22 years on the job, and the expression of someone who has seen every species of lobby theater. And at 9 o'clock exactly, the Verlaine's Tenant Association intercepted, per counsel's choreography, our attorney, politely invoking the tenant's right to be heard. Felix, PE license number offered up front, conflict of interest disclosed up front, I'd rather you weigh my bias than discover it, and 1 banker's box. Kessler's attorney objected to all of it on general principle. Inspector Reyes looked at the box the way I look at an interesting X-ray, and said the words that ended the war. I've got time. I read fast. She read the June photos, clean joists, time-stamped, against the same bays today, fresh kerf marks, sharp-edged, sawdust on top of dust. She watched 40 seconds of a garden hose feeding a footing since March, and 11 time-stamped clips of a 2 a.m. crew, aerial footage courtesy of a 16-year-old whose mother is no longer objecting. She read Marisol's affidavit about the bags of dust brought in. And then Felix rolled the 1928 blueprints out on the lobby's marble table, set Petrosian's report beside them, and put his finger on the north wall, and said one sentence, quiet as a verdict. Inspector, the girder this report condemns has never existed. Clear span on paired columns since 1928. You can verify it in 20 minutes with a borescope, and I brought two. Reyes looked at the blueprint, at the report, at Kessler, whose showroom smile was still up but now hanging on one hinge. Well, she said, let's go meet this girder. 25 minutes in the basement. I'll spare you the engineering and give you the vital signs. The borescope went into the north wall and found where Petrosian's report grieved a rotting beam, exactly what a mason's great-grandson promised, clean paired columns and empty air. It went into the joist bays and found saw cuts with bright faces, weeks old, not decades. The moisture meter followed the wet exactly as far as a garden hose reaches, and not one brick further. The building took the stand, and the building did not lie. Inspector Reyes climbed back into the lobby, took off her gloves, and addressed the room in the tone I use for chart discrepancies. There's no emergency here, except the one somebody built. Inspection request denied. Stop work order on all of it. Referral to our integrity unit. She looked at Kessler for the first time with her whole face. And Mr. Kessler, don't touch that basement. It's not a repair site anymore. It's a scene. It came apart the way these things apparently always come apart. Procedurally, which was poetry. The DA liked the hose footage. The licensing board unpended itself with remarkable speed once the blueprints hit the file. Petrosian surrendered his stamp and his testimony in the same season, and his testimony had Kessler's fingerprints all over the template. The vacate that was meant for 91 of us landed instead on Kessler's control of the building, receivership first, then a sale, to a non-profit housing trust, with the tenant association holding a seat at the table, and a Moreau, once again, on paper. My ceiling got fixed by contractors who work daytime hours. My rent is stabilized in a building certified sound by the city, twice, with prejudice. And the epilogue I promised, 3 weeks after the 21st, at 2:11 in the morning off a 12-hour shift, I stood in our hallway between 4C and 4D, with my heart going like a code alarm, and I slid my spare key under Felix's door, wrapped in a yellow sticky note with 4 words on it. In case you ever want in, 4D, 5 words, whatever. I counted them the way I wanted to. His door opened before I'd made it back across the hall. He was holding the note like a load-bearing document. For the record, said the man who measures everything, I've wanted in since the kettle note, and the Verlaine's thin walls can confirm the rest. And no, you can't see the logbook. Before you go, 2 questions. Real answers, in the comments. Because this whole story happened in a building where everyone had one piece of the truth, and nobody compared notes until it was almost too late. First, if a neighbor you'd never really spoken to slid a key under your door at 2 a.m. with a note like that, honestly, what would you have done? Used it the day you got locked out, like I did? Left it in a drawer? Called someone? Tell me exactly what you'd have thought at 2:11 a.m. because I've heard every theory in my building's lobby, and I want yours. And second, the real one. Who is your Felix? The quiet neighbor, coworker, or friend who was watching out for you long before you ever knew it. The one you only found out about later, or maybe suspect but have never asked? What's the small thing they did, the key, the note, the umbrella brought in from the rain, that you didn't understand at the time? Put their story in the comments. Somewhere down there, somebody's sliding a key under a door tonight, terrified it looks strange, and your story is the reason they'll do it anyway. If this one kept you reading to the last line, subscribe, because next week I'm telling you about the storage unit my late husband paid for, in cash, for 9 years, and the woman who was standing in front of it when I finally opened the door.